It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers. Thank you so much for being here. My guest for this episode comes to us from my northern neighbor of Canada. He is the award-winning author of 4 works of literary fiction, including the acclaimed Grin Reaping, Kinmount, A Matter of Will, and his newest release, a book called Ruff. He is Rod Carley. Rod, welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger and the Quiller Nation.
Great to be here, Steve.
You know, right off the bat, Rod, I wanted to talk about your newest book, Ruff, because I love that right off the beginning, you know, the title of the book in itself is this clever play on words, and the logo on the cover is this ruffled upstart crow, as it were, with this dripping quill hanging out of his beak. And it tells us immediately that this is a fun, often irreverent, and highly comical book set in Shakespearean times.
That was exactly the idea in terms of the design of the cover. Was to, and with the title Ruff, right, which has so many multiple meanings, besides the sort of starched curly collar one wore around one's neck in Shakespeare's day as a kind of unsuccessful spelled rough today, R-U-G-H, so like a rough draft, a rough day, rough and ready, those expressions. As an adjective, it referred to a boisterous braggart. Interesting enough, it was sort of like in Shakespearean's time, rough like that was kind of like how we use LOL today, like laughing out loud. It was a kind of code for laughter, which I found quite interesting. Of course, it's the bark of a dog, and it's the little a little drum roll, rough. So I wanted to play with those multiple meanings in the title, and also because the book deals with the Elizabethan punk scene, because there was a punk scene of sorts then that. I parallel, not directly, but the flavor of our punk scene of the 20th century, the late 1970s. I wanted a title that jumped out kind of 3D, like punk graffiti. And so the artist who did the cover design deliberately was trying to capture that sense of punk lettering. And then, of course, yes, the upstart crow with the dripping quill there, without any spoilers, that crow does play a major part in the narrative.
Well, I'll try to make sure during our conversation that I don't reveal any of the little secrets that you discover along the way through the book. But I will say, you know, it's fun. It's cleverly written. I found myself laughing out loud in certain portions. Now, part of that was because of my connection to Shakespeare and my experience with the works of Shakespeare. And you put in what I like to call, there are Easter eggs just about every page or so.
Definitely.
For folks like me. But yes. I believe that it would be, I mean, it's hard to say, it's hard to set myself aside, but I believe it's an enjoyable book, even if you don't have that type of Shakespeare background or knowledge. But of course, you know, the great bulk of my audience does. So I think it's one of the reasons why they'll really enjoy. It's a quick, fun read. I think they'll really enjoy it.
Well, I was trying to write on 2 levels with it. Yes, in terms of Shakespeare lovers, experienced Shakespearean practitioners. There's lots of fun with, you know, idea of how did Macbeth come to be, and I'm playing with, quotes from future plays that somehow Shakespeare overhears in his daily life, and how he steals or borrows them, how they might be, used later on. And there's one chapter, right, where his wife is complaining once again that anything she says, he is stealing and putting in his plays, which of course he denies. And part of it too was I didn't want the book. Well, this comes back to, and both of us are also directors of Shakespeare, right? And I think it's really important that Shakespeare isn't presented as some sort of dusty museum piece. That it needs to be accessible to our modern audience today, which is the reason why he still produced, 400 and some years after his death. And the same way, if one's going to write a work of literary fiction with Shakespeare as a central character, I think one has to have something fresh to say. It can't be a dull historical dusty novel. So in that aspect, and also I am not a bartolator. I don't subscribe to false idolatry. I don't hold Shakespeare in a pedestal. When directing Shakespeare, you need to get him right down on the rehearsal floor where he belongs. And in writing a book with him as a separate character, I needed to get him right down on the smelly, dirty streets of London where he belongs, and to truly humanize him. And so in the case of this book, the central character happens to be this poet named William Shakespeare, who was very successful at this point in the book when we meet him, but he's going through a midlife crisis. He's got domestic problems back in Stratford, where he sends his money home because he's bought this large mansion called New Place to somehow try to capture some sense of his family gentility. He's got daughters that only see him at Easter and view him as this odd uncle they see. Well, his hairline keeps on receding. And he's on the eve of his 40th birthday, and he's feeling a bit irrelevant. And there's a lot of new young writers coming up the pipe that are nipping at his heels and feeling it's yesterday's news. So, and then I add into that he's, grieving the death of his dad, and his only son died a few years before. And so we've got this, really, in many ways, regular middle-aged guy just trying to cope with a huge series of obstacles. And I think that I'm hoping that's what makes it relatable to both the reader who is a Shakespeare lover and to the reader who may not be, but may then enter into this world through the way I've written it and find they might discover that they might then become a Shakespeare lover.
Well, as a post-Stratfordian, I would say that one of the things that I found so fun about the book is that you do, in my opinion, humanize William Shakespeare of Stratford in a way that I don't think any other book I've ever read actually does. As you mentioned, you put him right there into the real world that he lives in. I mean, you from page 1, when I opened it up and you opened the book with Will shoveling horse shit, I immediately started laughing out loud, and I went, "Oh, I'm going to enjoy this book. I'm sure of it." And I immediately thought, is this some sort of euphemism for the Stratfordian narrative, the sort of mythology that we've been fed through the years about, this guy, as you said, that people place on a pedestal? And here you're like, no, this is all horse shit. If he lived any life at all, it had to be a real life with real struggles, real problems. And let's start right from the bat. And I just cracked up at that right from the get-go.
Well, and what I think people sometimes forget, and is that he had no interest when he was writing about preserving his plays. They were like writing episodic television today, or more maybe like episodes of Saturday Night Live. They would rehearse quickly, up on their feet, on to the next one to pay the bills. And and he and Burbage, the company manager, it wasn't only their company members they had to feed, they also had all those families. So they were responsible for a lot of mouths to feed with their theater company. And Shakespeare spent most of his life, I believe, trying to make up for the reputation that the Shakespeare name suffered under his father, right? And so that he was in court trying to get back the Shakespeare coat of arms, and he bought New Place as a way of showing his hometown that he was back and he was successful. And that to me is, I think, really interesting. That's probably more that he's obsessed with in his day. Than thinking about his plays being preserved for posterity in any way. We're kind of lucky that we had Hemmings and Condell, those two friends of his in company, that made it their mission 7 years after his death to somehow, gather up all the pirated copies and find everything and somehow put them in the first folio. Otherwise, we would not be, producing or directing Shakespeare today.
Why a fictional book about Shakespeare? I mean, I know you have, and we'll talk a little bit about your history with Shakespeare and the works of Shakespeare, but why, how does this connect? It doesn't connect to any of your other books, really. And
well, it does indirectly, and I'll explain why.
Please.
My second novel, Kinmouth, is about a down-and-out director who's forced to go to this small rural farming community called Kinmouth to direct Romeo and Juliet for an outdoor summer theater festival. And he doesn't want to do this job, but he takes it because he has to pay the bills. And when he arrives there, he encounters every obstacle possible, and he becomes this reluctant emissary of truth in a battle between artistic integrity and censorship. And the name of this protagonist, the name of this, down and out director is Dave Middleton. And I made him the fictitious descendant of Thomas Middleton, who was a Jacobean playwright and much younger than Shakespeare in Shakespeare's day, but still in many ways a contemporary. And because we have some facts, historical facts, that suggest that Middleton may have written a couple of the witches' scenes in Macbeth. Now, we don't know if he collaborated with Shakespeare, if this was done after Shakespeare's death, if Shakespeare borrowed from some of Middleton's work to insert, whatever. We don't know all of that, but we do have pretty good evidence that Middleton was somehow involved. So when I was finishing off Kinmount, I got this thinking, wouldn't it be maybe interesting to take Shakespeare, who's at the top of his game, and then this young playwright Middleton, and what would happen? How would they have to work together in order to create Macbeth? And especially if they were enemies, and we've got the age difference, and we got Middleton's the new upcoming punk playwright, who wears his satchel slung low and his opinions even lower, and he thinks that Shakespeare's plays with these silly actors coming on with toy swords hitting each other, or these silly weddings at the end of comedies where everyone's married off, have no bearing on the world. And he wants to write plays about slum landlords and the poor and housing shortages and the real streets of London, and about the real women of London, and have women play those women. So he was, in direct contrast to what, Shakespeare was doing with his blank verse. So I thought it might be an interesting story to see how those two got pitted together and how that might lead to the creation of the Scottish play. And then, we had the pandemic breakout, and of course Shakespeare wrote this during the plague after the Queen had died, when James came in to be the new king. And so it just naturally triggered me to go, and then all those other layers were part of it. So that's kind of how that was sort of the birth of Ruff in my mind, of how this story might play out.
Well, so you mentioned there, and something I think that's important about the book is that it's actually not set in Elizabethan times. It's set in Jacobean times. Elizabeth is already dead when the book begins. James is the new king, and you make sure that is a big focus of the story that you're trying to tell.
Oh, very much so. I mean, you got James coming in. First off, he was a bit of a wackadoodle and with a serious witch burning hobby. And he's coming in, right, to England as a Scottish king, and he wants to, unite Scotland and England, which the English don't want. And he arrives, and the English being very xenophobic against the Scots, because the Scots often teamed up with the French to do battle with them. He wasn't received very warmly. In fact, I imagine his popularity dropped lower than Loch Ness when he was first on the throne. So I have a lot of fun playing with that, what that looked like. And then in the book, his advisors were trying to find a way to build up his popularity with the masses very quickly. And it's Sir Francis Bacon who suggests, how much people love going to the theater. So why don't you have a play competition, and you can choose who the winners are, and that will go a long way, to your upping your approval rating. So that plays in. Yeah. So you're right. So the book, the first 7 chapters are at the very end of the Elizabethan era, obviously, because the Queen dies. And then we're right into the birth of the Jacobean era. And, and the problem too with that for James is that everyone worshiped the Queen. So he's living in her shadow in those early, during the time of this book, and doing everything that he can to try to make himself stand out. And that adds to even more problems within the book. And of course, there's also an underlying assassination plot that's going on within it. And that all ties into his own popularity. And also within all that, we've also got the Puritans who have a majority in Parliament. And, the Puritans, who believe that the cause of plague was sin, and that the cause of sin was the theater. Therefore, the cause of the plague was theater. Arguments like that we, that we're hearing, strangely enough, today. That kind of nonsense no one believed that they would ever become a majority in Parliament, right? And I think, like say, and as you know very well, no one believed back in 2016 that Donald Trump would beat Hillary Clinton, right? So people are underestimating this new energy of the Puritans, and they are a major foil in the book, because anything King James wants to try and do, they're vetoing because they have that power. And so they're really, locking down and trying to banish the theater and many other things. So that just adds to Shakespeare's ulcers.
I did draw those comparisons back in 2019 when we were suffering all the COVID lockdowns and all of the restrictions, and some of them that at the time, of course, immediately felt kind of arbitrary. And then we were told that, no, this is science and it's going to help protect and save everyone. And then we learned later that, no, a lot of them were kind of arbitrary, and people who were making the decisions didn't even really know what they were doing. And it felt like at the time, and I made comparisons to the Puritans and the shutdown of the theaters during plague time. 1609 particularly was a really crazy time when the Puritans were getting kind of nutsy about wanting to shut down the theaters and using a plague as their excuse for actually implementing their ideologies. And when I raised those comparisons back in 2019, 2020, people, pointed at me as some sort of conspiracy theorist and crazy tinfoil person. And now, you look back on it and it plays out and you go, wait a minute, there were people who were using this tragedy to their advantage, whether it was financially or ideologically. There is absolute truth in that, and there's no way to deny it now.
Well, what's interesting, and when you say that, one of these facts that people forget is that between 1606 and 1610, there were so many plague outbreaks going on there, and the plague being used as an excuse by the Puritans to close down the theaters, that they were only open for 9 months over that 4-year period. So you think about, no wonder he retired. Well, I think he finally retired after Henry VIII caught fire, in the opening performance and burned the Globe down. That's enough for a middle-aged writer to say, I think I've had enough. But in those 4 years, think about those plays that they had 9 months, 4 years to get them up and sort of survive in those 4 years, how well those plays had to do in a very short period of time, because the theaters were closed, 80% of the time. It's, that would be like us coming back, and having another 4-year lockdown where businesses were only open for 20% of the time in the next 4 years, or arts organizations and trying to survive again in that, which essentially would be impossible.
One of the things that I really enjoy about the book is your clever use of characters from history and how they play a role in the story you're telling, as well as some of the characters that you create that are, part of your fictional section of characters. That I found very Shakespearean in the clever names, almost Dickens-like, if you will, of some of the characters that you used. And I found myself chuckling here and there, especially when, some character that I'm familiar with from history popped in. I was like, oh, what an interesting way to use that person from history. And then, like I said, some of these fictional characters who pop in to sort of flesh out the world you're creating is very fun. What type of a character map do you use when you're writing a book like this to keep track of what names you've used, how you've used them? What does that process look like?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so with this book, I spent about 6-7 months. I mean, and like yourself, having worked in many years in the theater and directing Shakespeare, there's a lot of the social, political, historical background that is sort of at my fingertips from years of interpreting and producing. But I needed to go in and do some really specific research around the reign of James, the early year of that reign, more around the Queen's death and plague protocols at that time. So that, and also looking at the day-to-day life on the streets of London. So when I got around to writing the book, I could slide all the research away. I could swipe, right with that research, or swipe left, I suppose, and then just live and walk the streets and smell them and hear them, so I could start writing. When it came to the characters, then I outlined this book for about 7 months, spent outlining it and arriving at what the chapters might look like and what's in each chapter. and knowing what the ending would be, so I could kind of go like reverse dominoes back to the beginning. There's a very good book on directing, David Ball's Backwards and Forwards, a manual for reading plays, and it's much about that. How once you know the last domino, you can then find out what the opening, how the opening line of any play has to be performed or interpreted, because you know where you end. So I went through that process and figuring out the different chapters. So then as I was figuring out the different chapters, I was then starting to figure out which characters would people these chapters, and then where I would start adding in. So the fun for me was, for example, and small characters like a taxi driver who adds something to the superstition in the play about, that the Little Ice Age, their climate change crisis was, of course, being caused by, Scottish witches, so like fake news was alive and well in Shakespeare's society, and then also fictitious animals. I figured Shakespeare had to have a dog, so a three-legged beagle named Biscuit, and the fact that probably Biscuit got a more accurate sense of the news sniffing another dog's butt than the average Londoner did listening to the news from the streets, which hasn't changed very much. So then you had that, and then adding in the character of Edmund Tilney, Master of the Rebels, his idiot nephew Buck. So I could start laying in some of that fun. Dogberry, the candle maker, who lives in the same apartment housing that Shakespeare's in, and making him a living, breathing malaprop was fun. And also looking at maybe that's where Shakespeare took the name Dogberry for Much Ado. Fun with that. The creation of the character Nat, who is the non-binary character in the company, who plays boys and girls roles, and they became a very important character in the book for me because of their incredible positivity and a voice of the future, for speaking for all 14-year-olds still today especially. And one of my favorite characters, Maggie Marbeck, who does exist in history, but all we know about her is that she was married to Thomas Middleton. Her brother was probably an actor with the Admiral's Men. Her dad was the Queen's physician, and her grandfather wrote the music for the Anglican liturgy. But that's it. So I had a very good time with her, making her a feminist before the world even existed, so that she's fighting for women's equality and equity, and for a right for a woman to tread the board. So that character became a real pistol in the book, like a blowtorch of change driving the book forward. And then along with that, certainly other characters that would drop in. So you're asking about my character map. The character map kind of happened as I was outlining the book and figuring out where these characters, would appear. And where they were handy is because I think they help the reader get another look at some of these other characters, because they're almost like binoculars or chroniclers, having the smaller characters who are observing things and commenting on things.
Well, it's really interesting because when you the style is such that you're right. We sort of see these larger than life historical characters through the eyes of your fictional characters, and it helps us be the fellow observer with those characters, I think, as we follow the story.
Yes, that was the intent. So I'm
your art. It is filled with fun allusions to actual historical details of, the early reign of King James, as you mentioned, his affinity for the occult. And you use that common theory that Macbeth was written to please him in a variety of different ways, including the Banquo references, obviously. But what I found really fun was, and very interesting, and probably a lot of my listeners might not be aware, you delve into and this is hilarious. You have the three ladies who basically become the prototype of the three witches in the play, that he's stealing from them, working in the kitchen together, making soup or stews or elixirs or whatever. And one of the things that I really loved about that moment was, these women are explaining that some of the terms they're using are slang terms for actual kitchen products that they use on a regular basis, and that it's not really this, black magic potion that he comes up with when he has these witches referring to certain ingredients that are basically stuff that they would have on their spice rack, kind of a thing. And that was a really fun moment in the play for me. I mean, in the book. Look, I called it a play. That's hilarious.
Yeah, well, and that was fun. The fact that that a lot of these herbs. I'll back it up a little bit with the idea that with Anne Hathaway, right, Christian on the outside, pagan on the inside, in that sense, and that of course Will has no idea what's really going on beneath his wife's petticoats and what she has to put that front on, but what she's really doing, and making the choice that she's a naturopath because only the wealthy could afford to go to a doctor. So in this case, it would have been Dr. John Hall, who Shakespeare's eldest daughter Susanna did marry. So that's in the book, but Hall in the book is a Puritan, so Shakespeare there's no love lost there between the two of them. But Anne Hathaway then is a naturopath for the village of Stratford, and that's where all the people come to get remedies for different illnesses they have, and so she does it with different herbs and things. So the naming of things like with newts and dogs and dragons and all of those different elements, a dogwood we know is a plant anyhow, but they were coded to protect the identity of these different ingredients for what she was doing. And they had to be coded to protect her during this time. So that, yeah, you're right. So also it's great fun because we discover that, yes, what we think is like a satanic black magic with these horrible, horrible ingredients is actually just, the common vernacular of these different weeds and herbs and such that are growing out in the fields outside of Stratford. And that was important to ground it in that kind of reality. Also really important in the book is about how the women are fighting strongly about how these women are going to present it in the play, which is how they eventually became the weird sisters, the sisters of fate, and not the kind of witches that James was, burning women arbitrarily, thinking that they were causing, whatever, his cows to go dry, or that they sunk a ship when he was coming home with his bride from Denmark, Anne. And so that trying to right those wrongs by recognizing that all these women it's kind of like an ancient book club, right? This is about all the women that come together, and they were healers and all different backgrounds, and they could be together. And there's a line here, I'm paraphrasing from my book, but it's a line that Anne Hathaway has about, why is it that when a group of women get together and talk, they call it old wives' tales, but when a group of men get together and talk, they call it religion and philosophy, right? So the book, I have a lot of fun in the book, presenting those very strong cases of the female characters and showing up the males for being, in many ways, the idiots that they are.
Well, that's very much a common theme throughout the Shakespearean canon. In several of the plays, you have references to, standing over a gossip's bowl and women tattering together. And
yes.
it is a common theme that he uses regularly for mostly those characters that are extremely patriarchal. Characters such as like Lord Capulet, for instance, is the first one that comes to mind, who, is chiding the nurse and saying, go gossip somewhere else, go do your tattering somewhere else type of a thing. I found those, when you're familiar with the canon, again, as I mentioned, the book is, obviously a lot more fun in that sense, but I also think that it's fun from, sort of a layperson's approach to it. I'll use that term, but it's also fun from, like I said, from a post-Stratfordian point of view, because I compared it while reading it to like some of the, let's say, conjectures that you create through your story, through needing to tell this version of the story, like Anne Hathaway being one of the sources for a witch. I mean, any of the things that you create in the book are as viable as anything we've ever read before about the story, because of the fact that we don't have any evidence or proof that it wasn't that way. And, but I also found it really fun and interesting to see your references to like him using Holinshead's Chronicles, for instance, as source material, and some of the other references that you use, made my post-Stratfordian hairs bristle on the back of my neck as, you definitely know your stuff, and you've used that to create this very fun, fictional, comical version that, like I say, is probably just as true as any other version that we've read by Greenblatt or Shapiro.
That's right. Well, yeah. And Burbage references, Holland and says, basically, oh my God, I'm so, oh my God, you're finally you're departing from that bore, right? Boring historian, right? And so there's zings that we take at that historical source, right? Yes, very much so. Yeah.
Well, and when you mentioned the zings, I think that is part of the great humor of the book. Is there are plenty of, as I would say, quills being barbed, and stabbed at others with the pen being mightier than the sword, in that satirical sense of what you're doing with the storyline.
Well, I think for me with that, Stephen, is as like when in Shakespeare's day, they didn't talk about going to see a play; they talked about going to hear a play. So, and they were an oral society. So their audience and everyone living in that world were used to fast wordplay. They were used to wit, whereas we're a visual society and we can see, 55 fast edits in a Marvel action movie and not get a headache. But we could never go back to Shakespeare's era and pick up with the speed that they could, the wordplay and the wit. So these characters lived in their wit. Not characters. People lived in their wit. They lived in their wordplay. They lived in their voices. So when writing the book, I really wanted to capture that sense of all of these characters who do live in language. Well, they make their living from it, but they do live in language, and they live with wit and a very fast wit. As I was trying then by keeping a contemporary feel to the language in the book, but trying to still harken back to that celebration of the oral society that was Shakespeare's world.
That's a really excellent point. And I point that out to actors all the time when I'm directing a Shakespeare play, is that reference that you made about people going to hear a play, and how it's really a modern thing to say to go see a play. Mm-hmm. And even in the canon, we have references, like, for instance, when Theseus in A Midsummer Night's Dream is talking to the Philostrate about what entertainments for the evening, and he says, "I will hear that play."
Yes.
And he makes that very clear. And one of the things that I share with actors is, I say to actors all the time, acting is 90% what you do. It is only 10% what you say. However, 100% of what you say is 90% of how you say it. And that's those acting choices that are held and done in the diaphragm and in the chest and in the vocal cords and in the breath, in the sense of tone, inflection, rate of speech. Those are all acting choices that actors must make. And if they make them well, regardless of the antique nature of some of the language, an audience will follow perfectly.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and with Shakespeare especially, right? You're acting on the line, right? You are the joy of the arguments of the characters. For me in Shakespeare always is that as an audience, you're watching a character puzzle something out, right? Everything is in some ways a riddle to be figured out, and the dialogue is structured to allow us to sort of almost like cut away, the into the cranium and actually see the brain at work, right? That's to me, that's what I love about it, right? Is just watching these characters puzzle their way through the question that they have to try to come to some kind of answer.
Well, and the monologue of the mind is the most crucial part to performing a character well. And if you view every line as its own soliloquy, in a sense, that it's a character thinking out loud to the audience or to the other characters on the stage, I think you find a more genuine portrayal of the role.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And it's interesting, with soliloquies, it's much like being a humor writer, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Is for soliloquies, a character it's, whether it be Hamlet or whoever is speaking to the audience, an actor's way in with that is, recognize that everyone else there that you're addressing right now thinks exactly like you do, which is why you're then able to be free to express your innermost thoughts. And when writing a book, because a question I get asked so often is like, do you think about who your reader is, or this or that? And my argument is no. All I know is that I have to write what I think will make what makes me laugh and what engages me. And then just like an actor doing a soliloquy, I need to just imagine that all of my readers think exactly like I do and see the world the way I do, and then it's going to work. But you can waste a lot of unnecessary energy on trying to write for a certain reader. You can't. You only can write for yourself, right? So anyhow, that's a digression. But I just when we start talking soliloquies, it made me think of that.
No, I think my audience really enjoys when I have an author on the program to see some insight into the creative process and the thinking that goes behind the creation of a book or a novel, or even sometimes if it's somebody who's a researcher and it's, a lot of the details of where they look, why they look where they look to find what they need in order to flesh out their research. So that's very insightful. I've had a lot of authors who say that things to the effect of that the characters speak to them and they write it down almost as if there's some sort of transmedium channeling the spirits of these characters. And I would think that in that instance, then you're the audience. The author is the audience that the author is writing to. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes. That does make sense.
And I kind of feel like basically that's kind of what you said is it's sort of like you're the audience and the readers who are eventually going to pick up the book are almost like this Greek chorus following along in the storyline. If that's an image that I can sort of create.
That's a good way of putting it. Good way of putting it, Stephen. Yeah.
Well, let's shift gears for a minute and tell me about your relationship with Shakespeare. When did it begin? How did it begin? How long has it been that you've been, had such an affinity for this author and his works? And then we'll talk a little more about some of your more recent history with that.
Sure thing. Well, I've had about a 41 year relationship with Shakespeare. Actually a bit longer if I think about when I first saw a Shakespearean production produced. So I guess it would be more like 45 years. So I was first exposed to Shakespeare here in Canada. I grew up in a small city known as Rockville, Ontario, and you're probably aware of the Stratford Festival in Ontario. It's one of the biggest Shakespearean festivals in North America.
Of course.
Well, they still do this, but when I was in high school, there would be the annual bus trip where you would go to the Stratford Festival and you'd see a matinee designed for students. And so I was very lucky in my first exposure of going to Stratford. It was under the artistic directorship of Robin Phillips, who ran that festival from 1974 to 1980. And he was a brilliant director and with a great artistic sensitivity. Anyhow, it was Richard III. And it starred the American actor Brian Bedford as Richard, and Maggie Smith was in that season. Wow! And I remember seeing it, and the spectacle just blew my mind. And the design, wardrobe, and then the actors, their emotional commitment. And I think I was 15, so the dialogue I wasn't completely understanding. But when we watch a streaming service, a foreign film, and suddenly after about half an hour, you recognize that you're not really watching the subtitles anymore. You're actually watching the film because you're starting to understand the language to a degree more so. And I found that was happening for me. And when I came back after the intermission, I said, oh, wait a minute. This is just Yoda talk. They're talking object, verb, subject.
I use that reference all the time. I use that comparison to actors all the time. This is just Yoda speak.
Exactly. Well, there we are. So great minds here, Stephen. So it's kind of like Yoda. And so then the second act made a lot more sense to understand. And then for the rest of my high school years, I got really intrigued in reading the plays, and to me, they always were like flesh and life, real people that were lifting off the pages. So for example, I wanted to date Rosalind from As You Like It. I thought, what an amazing young woman, that she tests Orlando to make sure he's not a player. Like that's the kind of person you want to know in your life. and or debate philosophy with Hamlet, or play a good game of squash with Prince Hal. They stuck with me. So when I went to study, I studied theater at York University in the early 80s. And in my third year, I met my mentor. He was a man named Neil Freeman. And at that time, he was just studying the first folio of 1623. And he was looking at the original manuscripts and the original clues that were there for actors before modern editorial practice, standardized punctuation. And a lot of these original clues were, were erased, unwittingly erased, eradicated. And so I got excited by looking at the original use of punctuation and capital letters and strange spellings, and how the blank verse got changed to prose or vice versa by modern editors. So I became a bit like a Shakespearean paleontologist, diving into the language of these plays. And there's some real wild changes that were made from the originals. So when I direct, I work from the folio. I have the folio and I have the Riverside. I have my modern version to understand the play easily enough, and then the folio, which is rather delicious irregularities live. So when I finished my theater degree, and I was out testing the waters with some of my Shakespeare ideas, and of course, no one's going to hire a 23-year-old director at this point. So
Don't I know it? I remember those days too. Yeah, it was so hard to get a gig. No one wanted an untested director. And how do you gain experience if no one will give you a chance? It was so hard breaking in.
It is. It's the catch-22 of our business. So I found some, community theaters that were willing to let me test my ideas out, and I did. And eventually that led, and I got hired at the Stratford Festival as a resident assistant director for a couple of seasons. And that opened doors where I began then teaching Shakespeare, acting Shakespeare at different theater schools in Canada. And I was doing a lot of community outreach where I was going in and guest directing, and I was adapting Shakespeare into certain modern settings, but still going back to the original political, historical, societal of the play to make sure that they overlapped, that they matched, right? Like a medical transparency. Like I did Julius Caesar, loosely based on the JFK assassination at one point. So I was doing that all through the 1990s. And then I eventually moved up to a northern Ontario city called North Bay, where I founded an acting training school, college program, because there was no training at that point north of Toronto in Ontario. And that's when I began going further and finding Canadian historical settings that matched with the original script. So I was doing that all through that period. And I received an award. They used to have, there's a network in our province called TV Ontario, which is quarterly the equivalent of PBS in the States. And they had for about 5 years this competition, this Best Lecturer Big Ideas competition, kind of like The Voice for academic geeks, I guess. So what would happen is
who were the judges? Lecturers, just out of curiosity.
Academics, they would submit an audition lecture, and I had 3 students nominate me. So I did a taping of a lecture on the first folio of Shakespeare and how that worked. And anyhow, it made its way in, and somehow I became one of the 10 finalists. And so then the TVO film team came up and they did a little documentary on me. And then they recorded my lecture for the competition, which was called, for my case, Adapting Shakespeare Within a Modern Canadian Context. And, and then all the lectures aired from the different professors. And then there were academics that were judges and other professors, but then it was also open to audience voting, just like The Voice and all those kinds of shows, right? So anyhow, I ended up winning. And so it was nice because I won a substantial scholarship for my acting program that now lives on as a scholarship. The interest of it, each student every year gets this in their graduating year. So so I've been continuing directing and teaching Shakespeare, and then also when I began writing literary fiction with Kinmount, and of course Ruff, and my first book, A Matter of Will. It's about an actor who makes some really poor choices and hits rock bottom and ends up in AA and meets this unconventional minister who starts him on this quest to find his mighty purpose. And anyhow, but there was a brief stint where he was a Shakespearean actor in that. So Shakespeare has accompanied me through through most of my adult life, I have to say.
Has there been any brief stint in your life when you wandered into the world of being a theologian, the way that your character in Matter of Will wanders
I
into
have
theology?
always, well, I subscribe, to the Hamlet viewpoint of that there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in our philosophy. So I've always been curious about what's out there. So yeah, I have explored, yes, in terms of divinity, yes, I have an interest in theology, but I have an interest in mysticism. I have a lot of interests. My books are all peppered with a certain amount of magic realism because of my general curiosity into what's out there. And I've had, and I'm sure you too must have had some experiences that one just can't explain away logically, right? Science won't answer the question. It's moving into a whole other reign, and I find that absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I have to agree with that, and we could do an entirely different episode just on that topic alone. But of course,
I'm sure we could. Yeah,
my audience would never forgive me if we didn't address the giant elephant in the room, and that is, and I found myself asking this question as I was reading through the book. Because of certain references that you make and certain little stabs, like you mentioned, some of the zingers that you put in there, and some of the, I would call it almost farcical nature of the scenarios that you create. Like I mentioned right from the get-go, Will shoveling horse dung at the beginning of the book. And I found myself asking and waiting to now ask you this question: how much of the Shakespeare authorship mystery are you aware of? And what is your knowledge of that or interest in that, if any? And tell us a little bit about where you stand with regards to that.
Okay, I'd be more than thrilled to answer that question, Steve. Okay, so here we go. As we know, there are various viewpoints as to who is the authentic author of these plays, right? There's the view that maybe it was the Earl of Oxford and the Bear, but because of his standing in the aristocracy, he could not lower himself to be a playwright, so that he secretly passed his plays on to the company and a fictitious name or an actor like Will Shakespeare. In the movie Anonymous, they deal with that certainly, and that because of the fact that Shakespeare would have had no access to living, as an aristocrat, and he never traveled. He could never afford to travel. So how did he know so much about how the court worked and about how Italy was and all that, unless he actually went to those places and was that? So there's that theory that it could have been, the Bear. It could have been Francis Bacon. Was it just a pen name for a group, a collective of playwrights, right? Kind of like, was it Franklin Dixon who wrote the Hardy Boys? It would go like that, all these different viewpoints about authorship. And they're all very, they come down to classism in many ways. And I look at it going, okay, so we've got William Shakespeare growing up in this rural farming community of Stratford. His father is a disgraced mayor. He's a glover, right? Shakespeare goes to a basic public education. Because of his father losing so much of the family money, there was no means for him to send his sons to university. So Shakespeare wasn't, a writer that got to go to Cambridge or Oxford like many of the others, most of the others. And he just came out of that background. But genius, the stroke of genius, whether it be Mozart or it's a visual artist, has no bearing on birth. I think in Shakespeare's case, this young guy, I like to believe that he saw some traveling players come through the Stratford, town hall when he was very young and was just enamored by it. And he developed a facility for language when he was going to school, and suddenly he was just this guy who had all of this, and he listened, and he listened, and he listened, and he had an outrageous imagination. And so when he finally made his way to London, and he's listening, and he's had to work. I mean, that was the fun of writing the opening chapter, that he's working as a parking attendant, right? Just, probably most of it had to start, whether you're working, as an usher or a box office attendant or something in your first professional theater gig when you're at a theater school. That was would be the kind of gig that maybe he'd have to get. But he just listened, and he was naturally gifted. And so I'm of the view that why couldn't this young man who grew up in a rural farming community be that kind of genius that he is, have that innate understanding of humanity, and have the ability that he does, because there have been other artists throughout history who you look at what they grew out of, and it seems quite implausible that they could be the talents that they are. It's just the natural sense of genius. So I subscribe to that. And in the end, I also, what I come down to in the end is, in the end, whether if it was Bacon or De Vere, or it was Shakespeare, or it was a group of playwrights under this giant manufactured pen name, in the end, it doesn't matter.
Well, I mean, I suppose it depends on your approach.
And that's what we go back to, in A Matter of Will, my first book, I actually have a fictitious De Vere festival where it's all of Shakespeare's plays being produced only under the name of Edward De Vere. So
I have long thought that somebody should do that. And yeah. Though my Shakespeare company is still called a Shakespeare company, not a De Vere company, we do make sure that in each of our programs and throughout our literature, and whenever anybody wants to ask me about it, that we share that theory that Edward De Vere is the true author. But I do think that there is a growing movement of, definitely among certain scholarly circles as well, that is subscribing more and more to the group theory. And then it becomes a matter of trying to determine who the editor-in-chief may have been, whether it was Bacon involved, whether it was De Vere involved, whether they were working together.
You know what? And I think it could be also along the different stages of Shakespeare's writing. When the New Oxford in 2016 came out with their latest version of Henry VI, right? In the front pieces, they acknowledged that it was both Marlowe and Shakespeare that now wrote Henry VI. So I think what we're discovering is there's more and more evidence of the amazing amount of collaboration that Shakespeare did, right? Which lends credence to what you're saying about the group idea. But certainly more so that Marlowe had a bigger hand in Henry VI than we ever thought originally.
Well, and if you look at your book, for instance, and I want to make sure my listeners know this, the lampooning that you do of Will, his wife, Anne, and characters like Burbage and Hemmings and Condell, and the way that you depict them, as you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, sort of this, down in the dirt, real people who had to live in the streets of London, which probably, by the way, was not a real fun place to live.
No, it wasn't. No.
But all of
You're
that,
lucky you made it home alive.
Yeah, all of that is very Quiller in nature, Quiller Nation. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to invite Rod to be a guest of the program and to discuss his book. It's not about whether he's a Stratfordian or an Oxfordian or a post-Stratfordian. It's about it being a very fun and humorous book that I think that readers can enjoy regardless where they stand on the authorship mystery, and will pull and find pieces out of it to support their position or where they feel or how they feel about it. And I think what you've proven, Rod, in the book is that because we don't have as many details as we'd like to have about this man from Stratford or the creation of the works, it opens the door for fantastical writing and literary license like you have taken with this book to create a very fun and humorous story that is a quick, easy read and enjoyable throughout.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Yes. And as you said, for a writer like me with an empathetic comic imagination, sometimes all one needs is a few morsels that you can then build with. And the fact that with Shakespeare himself, we've only got around 12 firsthand sources. So when you've got that, small skeleton, the fun was then building all the muscle around it and just playing, well, what if, based on these few facts, how this might have gone.
Are you still doing anything as a theater artist? Are you directing? Do you ever walk the boards yourself? What has happened with your theatrical career?
All of those things. I'm still directing. I'm currently working on a bilingual adaptation of Julius Caesar, which I hope to do at some point in 2026, loosely based on a chapter in Canadian politics back in 1970 with our then Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and a group of Quebec terrorists known as the FLQ that were fighting for a separatist Quebec. And it was a very stormy, hot chapter in our country's history. So I'm playing around with that as a template to reimagine Julius Caesar. And so I've been working on this adaptation for a while now. So I'm hoping to do that in 2026. And I've got a few other irons in the fires as well. Yes.
That's incredible.
And more writing, of course, and more writing. And I'm toying with, I'm not sure, there might be a sequel to Ruff or a spin-off from Ruff. I'm not sure, but it's certainly, I'm percolating with it.
Well, it sounds like you have an infatuation of sorts with Middleton, and you may need to write a book where he becomes the central character of the next book.
You never know. You never know. Yeah. Yeah, he's an interesting cat himself, very much so.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can find more information about Rod and his work at his website. It is www.rodcarley.ca. Carley is spelled Carley. So that's RODCARLEY.ca. It's a wonderful website, easy to navigate. You'll find more information about Rod. You'll find information about his 4 books, how to find them. You might be interested in one of the others other than Ruff. It is the newest one, and it is receiving all kinds of accolades. As I said, it is fun, it is funny, it is humorous, it is witty and clever, and it also is filled with wonderful historical allusions that those of us who have been followers of the Shakespeare canon for some time in our lives will find even exceptionally funny on top of the humor that Rod has already placed in. Also, Rod, you are available, according to your website, to speak to book clubs.
Oh, I love speaking to book clubs, Stephen, by all means. And if there's any of your listeners that have book clubs and would like me to zoom in for a book club event, I'd be more than happy to.
There are several out there who I'm sure right now are writing it down. Also, you are open to invitations to conferences, festivals, and other literary events.
Yes, I love. Yeah, I've just been on a 2.5-month national book tour here in Canada with the book, and I welcome invitations to conferences, festivals, wide open to it.
And even though it was your publishing house PR department that reached out to me, what I will tell listeners is it is very easy to contact Rod directly right through his website. His email address is right there. So you don't have to go through the publisher or the PR team to reach him and communicate to invite him to join your book club or to attend a conference, festival, or other literary event that you may want to have him come and speak about this new book or one of his other books, perchance. Again, it's rodcarley.ca. Well, Rod, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share with us here in the Quiller Nation some details about your writing process and the works that you've completed. The history that you have with Shakespeare is mesmerizing and definitely honorable in every respect from my position as a fellow theater artist.
Well, Stephen, I can just say that today was wonderful, most wonderful, and most wonderful. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate having you.
Great. Thanks again, Stephen.
Hey, Quiller Nation, before we wrap things up, I do want to make sure to give a shout out to our November Quiller of the Month, Edward Henke. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Edward. Is it Henke or Heineke? You can shoot me an email and correct me so that in the next episode, when I shout out to you again, I get it correct. I hope you enjoy your free item from the Quiller Swag Shop, and thank you for being a loyal listener and member of the Quiller Nation. I have noticed there is some increased traffic in the Swag Shop after the last episode when I encourage you all to wear your Quiller swag with pride to spark communications with others about the podcast. And I can tell you the best way to encourage producer Jake to create new items for the Swag Shop is when we see that increased traffic. I'd like to see some new stuff up there, and I'm going to give Jake a little bit of pressure to put some new items, some new designs up there for us. If you have an idea for a Quiller design, let me know. Shoot me an email. Don't forget, holiday season is upon us, and you can get that awesome Quiller gift in time for holiday giving to the people on your list. Also, another great way to spread the word about the Quiller Nation and Don't Quill the Messenger. Don't forget, you don't have to become a paid subscriber to become a member of our Patreon page. Patreon now allows people to become a member of a page without actually joining any of the subscriber levels. If you choose to join a subscriber level, we of course appreciate that, and every contribution helps us continue the program, and we are tremendously grateful to those of you who are continuing to be subscribers at any and all levels. But you will need to become a member, at least at the free membership level, in time to live stream our 6th anniversary episode coming up in January, the official live recap of our 6th season and the celebration of our 150th regular episode. Of course, if you do become a subscriber at the Serial Quiller level or above, you unlock our incredible library of 15 bonus episodes and growing for another 20 plus hours of Quiller entertainment and more bonus content to come. With that said, thank you again for joining us each fortnight. Thanks again to our guest, Rod Carley. Don't forget you can visit him at www.rodcarley.ca. And Quiller Nation, I just want to say once more, we certainly couldn't and wouldn't do all of this without all of you. So thank you once again for all that you do and for being here every 2 weeks to tune in to what we have going next. Don't forget to drop me an email to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com, contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. And until next time, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.